Yeah, well, I mean, that's a loaded question. You just loaded me up with the info and kind of these governmental bills in play or working to be in play to essentially discriminate against humans. I mean, that is what I very much see these bills as, is discriminating against humans, denying humans of rights. So in terms of how this is going to affect our students, I mean, I think we're silly to think that it's not going to affect our students. You know, in these bills kind of being proposed and I guess presented to the House. Students are working against this. Lobbyists are working against this. Unfortunately, the university won't necessarily take a stand on whether or not they agree or disagree with any of these discriminatory bills. However, there are definitely partners on campus working against these things. So I think in trying to think of some of the positivity in some of this, it's like it's getting students engaged, it's getting students fired up, it's getting students to maybe more critically think about their voting power and what that can mean for them in the future. However, that being said, these are discriminatory bills, and so this is going to hinder athletes within athletics here at MSU. And not only directly hinder the athletes for that particular House Bill 112, but as you mentioned, it's a culture shift, right? You know, MSU is on the Pride Index, is one of the best institutions in the nation for supporting LGBTQ plus students. How can we have that type of ranking and also be in a state in which we are completely denying a subset of humans or a group of humans? I think it's going to be, for those students who are on campus, it's really confusing. It's really disheartening to see these types of things go through. And for those prospective students, I think it's gonna hit MSU, whether we want to admit it or not. It's gonna hit us in terms of students who are looking at. I mean, you consider the major states that our out-of-state students are coming from: Washington, Oregon, California, Colorado. I mean, these states are not putting up with bills like this. I mean, bills like this are popping up all over the nation.
They are.
Another thing that we have to be honest in saying, that Montana is not the only place that is trying to do things like this. But if we kind of consider those students that have been and maybe will be looking at MSU, we're silly not to think that they're not going to take those things into consideration. Because us being a land grant institution, unfortunately, a lot of the policies, a lot of the things that happen on this campus are very intrinsically intertwined with what is happening at the governmental level.
Yeah, I feel like, so you answered a bunch of my questions, because I was going to ask about prospective students, and I see it not only as prospective students, but allies, right? Like, and that comes back to this thing about these bills don't just affect their target, right? And so, because what that does is it signals, right? We're signaling the culture, we're signaling the kind of state Montana is. And I feel like it's kind of naive in a way to just assume, like, oh, well, and maybe it's not this like cut and dried, but like, so the LGBTQ plus community is such a small subset of the population that, you know, maybe it's not going to be a big deal, but it's bigger than that, right? Like, it's going to play into other people's decisions. And I think it's unfortunate that I feel like that's being ignored.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And honestly, in some ways, I don't think it changes anything. The DISC is here to advocate. The DISC is here to build allyship. The DISC is here to educate MSU's campus. And whether these bills are in place, that those are all missions that we will continue to fulfill. I think it does change kind of the conversations around diversity, and diversity topics, inclusion topics, equity topics. It changes that conversation. I guess ultimately what I'm trying to say is, in having these type of bills go through government and people to stamp them to say, yep, we stand by them, we're cool with discriminating against these humans. There are absolutely students who will come to this campus that 100% sign on to those very bills. Or there are students on campus who already sign on to those very bills. And so rather than kind of starting at that high level of like, I mean, look at House Bill 112 and just like the layout of it and how it completely discriminates against intersex people or any person who would identify that way. And, you know, rather starting there, it's kind of like, we got to go back to the basics. And honestly, this has been really my campaign ever since I took this position over in June of 2020, is kind of starting from the basics, starting from like me personally, PJ Diamond, what's my identity? What's my cultural identity? What's my linguistic identity? What's my religious identity, my sexual identity, all of the things that pertain to me. How do I identify? All right, next person in the room, Holly, how do you identify? And all the various things that I have just mentioned. And we kind of get students, staff, and faculty talking about themselves. What do they hold near and dear? What are parts of their identity that they need to share? Before we kind of jump into these complex conversations about House bills discriminating against people, I think when it's at that level, it's really easy to kind of say, oh, that's wrong, it's discriminating against people, or oh, that's right. For whatever reason, somebody may say that it's right. It is not so easy to kind of introspectively look at yourself and what's your identity, how have you grown up, what are your morals, what are your values, and how do those things affect your daily life? How do they impact the interactions that you have every day? And then kind of take it up to an yeah, that's a great question. And I would love to see more of this. I will say, kind of very specifically, just 2 weekends ago, our Black Student Union and our Asian student group teamed together and had a rally here in Bozeman, basically speaking out against Asian crime or Asian hate crimes, but basically Black students and Asian students there in solidarity. So that is really like the key thing that comes to mind. However, other than that, not so much. I honestly think, you know, this year and COVID, like this year, COVID, lack of being able to gather, it's been really difficult for students to connect even among themselves as like particular identity or cultural groups, but then also kind of cross-culturally connecting. I think we're starting to see a little bit more of that. But with the end of the semester, it's definitely difficult. It's been a difficult year and it is difficult for students. But I guess I'll say lastly, in terms of students speaking out against some of these House bills, I would say there are students in athletics that have worked against this. There are students in our QSA and OSTEM that have been working against this, students in our Black Student Union that have been working against them. So there are bountiful voices at play. I guess it just depends on who's actually listening to them.